The flames licking at the cockpit grew hotter with each passing second as Flight Lieutenant Charles Hartwell fought to maintain consciousness above the French countryside on September 23, 1943. His Supermarine Spitfire had taken a direct hit from a Messerschmitt Bf 109, and black smoke now poured from the engine compartment as the aircraft spiraled downward through 2,000 feet of autumn sky. The acrid smell of burning aviation fuel mixed with the metallic taste of blood in his mouth as he struggled against the centrifugal force pinning him to his seat. Through the spider-webbed canopy, he could see German soldiers already moving across the wheat field below, their field-gray uniforms distinct against the golden stubble. His training screamed at him to bail out immediately, but something deeper held him back. Perhaps the knowledge that capture meant interrogation, perhaps the stubborn pride that had carried him through 27 previous missions over occupied Europe. What Charles Hartwell could never have imagined was that one of those enemy soldiers racing toward his crash site would risk his own life to pull a British airman from the wreckage, setting in motion a 30-year search that would transform two warriors into brothers. No one in the Royal Air Force's 609 Squadron knew that morning would birth a story of humanity that would outlast the hatred of war itself. Charles William Hartwell had grown up in the rolling hills of Gloucestershire, the second son of a country veterinarian who spent his days tending to the livestock of local farmers and his evenings reading adventure stories to his two boys by the fireplace. Born on March 14, 1921, Charles inherited his father's steady hands and his mother's stubborn determination, traits that would serve him well when he first climbed into the cockpit of a de Havilland Tiger Moth at the Royal Air Force College Cranwell in the spring of 1939. His childhood had been unremarkable in the way that would later make his story extraordinary. Long bicycle rides through Cotswold villages, helping his father deliver foals in the pre-dawn darkness, and building model aircraft with his older brother William, who would later die in the defense of Malta. The decision to join the Royal Air Force had come naturally to Charles, drawn by the romance of flight and the growing certainty that Britain would soon need every pilot she could train. His instructors noted his exceptional reflexes and his tendency to think independently under pressure, qualities that earned him both commendations and gentle reprimands throughout his training. By the time he earned his wings in early 1940, Charles had developed the reputation as a pilot who could improvise his way out of impossible situations, though none of his fellow aviators suspected that this skill would one day depend on the compassion of an enemy. The young man who left Gloucestershire carried with him the quiet confidence of rural England and a belief that doing the right thing mattered more than following orders, values that would be tested above the skies of France in ways he never anticipated. The summer of 1943 had brought a new intensity to the air war over Western Europe as Allied bomber crews pressed deeper into German-occupied territory, and Luftwaffe fighter squadrons responded with increasing desperation and skill. Operation Point Blank, the combined bomber offensive, was stretching both sides to their breaking points, with American Flying Fortresses and British Lancasters facing withering opposition from some of Germany's most experienced pilots, flying the latest variants of the Focke-Wulf 190 and Messerschmitt Bf 109. The statistics were sobering. Bomber Command was losing nearly 5% of its aircraft on each mission, while fighter escorts like Charles's 609 Squadron were engaging in daily battles that tested the limits of pilot endurance and aircraft performance. The tactical situation had evolved into a deadly chess match where German controllers, using increasingly sophisticated radar networks, could vector their fighters to intercept Allied formations with mathematical precision. British intelligence estimated that the Luftwaffe was fielding nearly 2,500 operational fighters across the Western Front, many piloted by veterans who had survived 3 years of continuous combat. For young pilots like Charles, Each mission meant penetrating a defensive network that stretched from the Dutch coast to the Swiss border, protected by some of the most advanced military technology of the 20th century. The psychological pressure was immense. Pilots were expected to complete tours of 25 combat missions, knowing that statistical analysis suggested only 1 in 4 would survive to see their tours end. Yet they continued to fly because the alternative, allowing Nazi Germany to complete its conquest of Europe unopposed, was unthinkable to men who had grown up believing that British determination could overcome any adversary. The mission briefing on the morning of September 23rd had been routine in the way that only wartime could make life-threatening endeavors seem ordinary. Charles and 11 other Spitfire pilots of 609 Squadron would escort a formation of 24 Boeing B-17 Flying Fortresses on a bombing raid against aircraft factories near Paris, providing top cover while the bombers approached their targets at 22,000 feet. Intelligence reports indicated moderate fighter opposition, perhaps 30 to 40 German interceptors rising from airfields around the French capital, and weather conditions were forecast as ideal with unlimited visibility and light winds. Squadron leader Geoffrey Morrison, a veteran of the Battle of Britain whose handlebar mustache had become legendary throughout the wing, conducted the briefing with the matter-of-fact professionalism that had kept him alive through 2 years of combat operations. The American bomber crews would cross the English Channel at 0900 hours, with British fighters joining the formation 10 miles south of Dover before proceeding to the target area. Primary concerns included the possibility of head-on attacks by Focke-Wulf 190s operating from Beauvais-Tilley, and the growing tendency of German pilots to ignore escort fighters in favor of pressing home attacks against the bombers regardless of casualties. Charles checked his parachute straps for the 3rd time as Morrison outlined escape and evasion procedures for any pilot forced down over occupied territory. Move south toward Spain, avoid all contact with civilians, and remember that the Geneva Convention meant little to Gestapo interrogators. What none of the pilots gathered in that Quonset hut at Royal Air Force Biggin Hill could have predicted was that one of their number would soon discover the difference between enemies and human beings in the most personal way imaginable. The formation crossed the French coast at 12,000 feet with a precision that had become second nature to Charles during his 8 months of combat operations. Below them, the green patchwork of Normandy farmland stretched toward the horizon under a clear September sky, while above, the contrails of the American bombers etched white lines against the blue. His Spitfire Mark IX responded to his touch with a familiar sensitivity that had kept him alive through 27 previous missions. Engine temperature steady, ammunition counters showing 300 rounds for each of his 4 20mm Hispano cannons, and fuel gauges indicating sufficient petrol for 3 hours of flight time. The radio crackled with the steady chatter of formation flying as 12 British fighters maintained their weaving pattern above and behind the bomber stream. Charles flew as Blue 3, positioned on the left side of the formation where he could cover the most vulnerable approach angle for attacking German fighters. Through his headset, he could hear the calm voice of Squadron Leader Morrison calling out navigational checkpoints and reminding his pilots to maintain radio discipline. The first indication of trouble came at 12:15 hours when ground radar controllers reported large formations of enemy aircraft climbing from airfields around Paris. Within minutes, the distinctive silhouettes of German fighters appeared as dark specks against the lighter sky to the east, growing larger with each second as they closed at a combined speed of nearly 600 miles per hour. Charles felt the familiar tightening in his stomach that preceded combat, a mixture of fear and anticipation that had become as much a part of flying as checking his instruments. He had no way of knowing that among those approaching German pilots was Oberleutnant Hans Müller, a 24-year-old former engineering student from Bavaria who had joined the Luftwaffe to defend his homeland and who carried in his breast pocket a letter from his younger sister, describing the Allied bombing of their family's village. The air battle that erupted over the French countryside lasted exactly 7 minutes and involved 43 aircraft engaged in a three-dimensional chess game played at 400 miles per hour. Charles found himself pursuing a Messerschmitt Bf 109 that had made a diving attack on one of the flying fortresses, following the German fighter down through 15,000 feet, as both aircraft pulled nearly 6 times the force of gravity in a spiraling descent that tested the structural limits of their machines. The German pilot was skilled, using every advantage of his fighter's superior diving speed and climb rate to avoid Charles's attempts to bring his guns to bear. Through the earphones of his flying helmet, Charles could hear the voices of his squadron mates engaged in similar duels scattered across 20 miles of sky, punctuated by terse warnings about additional German aircraft diving out of the sun. His Spitfire shuddered as he pulled harder on the control stick, trying to lead the target enough to compensate for the German fighter's erratic maneuvering. The mathematical precision required for aerial gunnery demanded that he calculate the intersection of two aircraft moving in 3 dimensions while subjected to forces that made coherent thought nearly impossible. For 30 seconds, Charles held the Messerschmitt in his gun sight as both fighters dove toward the French countryside below, his thumb hovering over the firing button as he waited for the perfect moment to squeeze off a burst. The irony would occur to him years later. In that moment of maximum concentration, he was trying to kill a man who would soon risk his own life to save Charles from burning to death. Neither pilot could have imagined that their duel would end not with victory or defeat, but with an act of humanity that would define both of their lives for the next 3 decades. The 20-millimeter cannon shells from the Messerschmitt struck Charles's Spitfire with the devastating effect of high-explosive projectiles, hitting aluminum skin at 400 miles per hour. The first round punched through the engine cowling and detonated against the supercharger housing, sending metal fragments ricocheting through the cockpit as the 1,200-horsepower Rolls-Royce Merlin engine began to tear itself apart. The second shell penetrated the fuel tank behind the pilot's seat, and within seconds, aviation gasoline was spraying into the slipstream, where it ignited in a sheet of orange flame that engulfed the aircraft's tail section. Charles felt the controls go slack in his hands as hydraulic fluid boiled away in the fires consuming his fighter, leaving him trapped in a machine that was rapidly becoming a flying coffin. Through the smoke and flames filling the cockpit, he could see the German fighter pulling away, its pilot apparently satisfied that the British Spitfire was finished. The altimeter unwound rapidly as the crippled aircraft entered an uncontrolled spiral, passing through 8,000 feet, with the flames growing hotter and the smell of melting aluminum overwhelming his oxygen mask. Training dictated an immediate bailout, but the canopy release mechanism had been damaged in the attack, leaving Charles trapped inside a burning aircraft with less than 2 minutes before it would impact the ground at terminal velocity. His hands moved automatically across the instrument panel, trying every emergency procedure he had memorized during training, while his mind calculated the rapidly diminishing options for survival. Through the flame-cracked windscreen, he could see German soldiers in a wheat field below, their rifles glinting in the afternoon sun as they prepared to capture or kill any Allied airmen who might survive the crash. What Charles could not see was that one of those soldiers was already running toward the projected impact point, motivated not by military duty, but by something deeper that transcended the uniforms they wore. Oberleutnant Hans Müller had been walking through the wheat stubble, checking defensive positions when the air battle erupted overhead, and he watched with professional interest as the British and German fighters engaged in their deadly ballet against the September sky. As a former engineering student at the Technical University of Munich, Hans possessed an intellectual curiosity about aircraft design that had served him well during his 18 months as a company commander in the Wehrmacht's 215th Infantry Division. He could identify most Allied aircraft types by their silhouettes, and had developed a grudging respect for the men who flew them into the teeth of German air defenses day after day. The sight of the burning Spitfire spiraling toward Earth triggered not triumph, but a complex mixture of emotions that surprised him with their intensity. Through his field glasses, he could see the British pilot struggling in the cockpit as flames consumed the aircraft's fuselage. And in that moment, Hans saw not an enemy, but a fellow human being facing the most terrifying death imaginable. His platoon sergeant, Unteroffizier Klaus Weber, shouted something about preparing to capture the downed airman, but Hans was already running across the uneven ground toward the point where the fighter would impact. The decision required no conscious thought. It arose from values his parents had instilled in him during childhood, in a Bavarian village where neighbors helped neighbors, regardless of their differences. Behind him, his soldiers called out warnings about the approaching crash, but Hans continued running toward what every military manual would have classified as an extremely dangerous situation. The mathematics of the situation were simple. A 3,000-pound aircraft traveling at 200 miles per hour would hit the ground with the force of a small bomb, and anyone within 100 yards of the impact would risk death from flying debris. Yet Hans Müller kept running, because sometimes human decency demands actions that defy tactical common sense. The Spitfire hit the French earth with the sound of civilization ending, cartwheeling twice across the harvested wheat field, before coming to rest in a crater of its own, making with its tail section completely severed and its engine buried 3 feet underground. Incredibly, the cockpit section remained partially intact, though aviation fuel had created a pool of fire around the wreckage that sent black smoke 500 feet into the autumn air. Hans reached the crash site less than 30 seconds after impact, his field uniform singed by the intense heat as he approached the burning aircraft from the upwind side. Through the shattered canopy, he could see the British pilot slumped over his controls, either unconscious or dead from the tremendous forces of the crash. The smell of burning gasoline mixed with melting rubber and the more ominous odor of cooking flesh, as Hans realized that the trapped airman would be burned alive within minutes unless someone could extract him from the wreckage. The tactical situation was clear. Hans was risking his own life to save an enemy who had been trying to kill German soldiers just minutes earlier, an action that could result in his court-martial if his superiors decided to interpret his behavior as treason. But as he studied the unconscious face of the young British pilot, Hans saw someone who could have been his own younger brother, Klaus, a university student whose life had been interrupted by a war neither of them had chosen. The decision to act required no further consideration, because Hans Müller had been raised to believe that human life possessed a value that transcended military objectives. His hands were already working to pry open the damaged canopy release when his platoon sergeant arrived at the crash site, shouting warnings about the spreading fire and the possibility that the aircraft's ammunition might begin exploding at any moment. Extracting an unconscious pilot from a burning aircraft required a combination of engineering knowledge, physical strength, and complete disregard for personal safety that would have impressed the rescue instructors at any military academy. Hans used his entrenching tool to pry away the twisted aluminum that had trapped Charles's legs, while Unteroffizier Weber reluctantly assisted by cutting through the pilot's safety harnesses with a bayonet. The heat was becoming unbearable as flames consumed the wing fuel tanks, and both German soldiers could hear the ominous crackling that indicated the fire was spreading toward the aircraft's ammunition storage areas. Charles remained unconscious throughout the extraction, his breathing shallow but steady as Hans lifted him clear of the wreckage and carried him to safety beyond the expanding circle of burning aviation fuel. Only when they had reached a position 50 yards from the crash did Hans allow himself to examine his decision with the analytical mind that had made him a successful engineering student. By any measure of military logic, he had risked German lives to save an enemy combatant who would eventually return to the war effort if he recovered from his injuries. Yet, as he looked down at the young British pilot's face, a face that belonged to someone's son, brother, or husband, Hans felt certain he had made the only choice his conscience would allow. The irony was not lost on him that Charles Hartwell, if he survived, would probably never know the identity of the German soldier who had saved his life, and Hans expected that he would never learn whether his act of humanity had any meaning beyond this single moment on a French battlefield. Neither man could have predicted that their brief encounter would eventually reshape both of their lives in ways that would endure long after the war's end. Charles Hartwell awoke to consciousness in a German military hospital near Amiens 3 days later with second-degree burns on his hands and face, a concussion that left him with intermittent memory loss, and the knowledge that someone had pulled him from his burning aircraft before it exploded. The attending physician, Stabsarzt Friedrich Kaufmann, explained in careful English that Charles had been rescued by German infantry personnel who had witnessed his crash, though the doctor could provide no details about the identity of his rescuers. Through the fog of pain medication and head trauma, Charles retained only fragmentary memories of the rescue, the sound of German voices speaking urgently, strong hands lifting him from the cockpit, and the distinctive smell of field uniforms and cigarette tobacco that he would later associate with continental European soldiers. What remained crystal clear in his memory was the realization that someone wearing a German uniform had risked death by explosion or burning to save a British airman, an act of courage that challenged everything he thought he knew about the nature of his enemies. During his 6 months as a prisoner of war, Charles questioned other captured Allied personnel about their experiences with German soldiers, searching for similar stories of battlefield compassion that might help him understand what had happened in that wheat field. Most prisoners reported treatment that ranged from correct to brutal, depending on the attitudes of individual guards and the military situation at the time of capture. Yet Charles occasionally encountered other Allied airmen who described acts of unexpected humanity, German pilots who had escorted damaged bombers to safety rather than finishing them off, infantry commanders who had shared medical supplies with wounded enemies, or submarine crews who had provided lifeboats and provisions to survivors of torpedoed ships. These stories suggested that warfare had not completely extinguished human decency, even among men trained to see each other as mortal enemies, and Charles began to understand that his rescue represented something larger than a single act of individual courage. The end of the war in Europe on May 8, 1945, brought Charles home to England with a profound sense that his survival had created an obligation he could not clearly define but could never ignore. His physical injuries had healed completely during his months in German custody, but the psychological impact of his rescue had left him with questions that would shape the rest of his life. During the post-war years, as Britain struggled to rebuild and Charles resumed civilian life as a civil engineer in his native Gloucestershire, he found himself thinking frequently about the German soldier who had saved his life. The question of identity became an obsession that consumed his spare time and eventually influenced major life decisions. Charles spent countless hours studying German military organization, learning to read German military records, and corresponding with former Wehrmacht personnel who had been captured by Allied forces. His wife Margaret, whom he married in 1947, initially supported his search as a harmless hobby that helped Charles process his wartime experiences. By the 1950s, however, his quest to identify his rescuer had become something approaching a full-time avocation that strained their marriage and confused their friends. Charles had compiled detailed records of German units that had operated in the area of his crash, cross-referenced with personnel rosters obtained from various archives and veteran organizations. He learned to speak conversational German and made annual trips to West Germany, beginning in 1953, visiting villages and veteran meetings in search of anyone who might remember the incident. His methodology was systematic and thorough, approaching the search with the same engineering precision he applied to his professional projects. What sustained him through years of frustration and dead ends was his conviction that the act of rescue had created a bond between two men that transcended the political circumstances of their first meeting, and that finding his rescuer would somehow complete a story that had begun in a burning aircraft over France. The breakthrough came in September 1973, exactly 30 years after the crash, when Charles received a letter forwarded through a German Veterans Association from a former Wehrmacht soldier named Klaus Weber, who remembered assisting in the rescue of a British pilot near Amiens in 1943. Weber, now a retired postal clerk living in Hamburg, provided the name and last known address of his former company commander, Oberleutnant Hans Müller, who had actually pulled the British airman from the burning aircraft. According to Weber's letter, Hans had survived the war, but had been severely wounded during the retreat from France in 1944, leaving him with a permanent limp and periods of depression that had made civilian life difficult. Weber's last contact with Hans had been in 1958, when his former commander was working as a construction supervisor in Munich and struggling with what would now be recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder. The letter included an address that was 15 years old, but Charles felt closer to solving his 30-year mystery than at any time since beginning his search. Within a week, Charles was on a plane to Munich with a briefcase full of documents and a heart full of emotions he could barely describe. The prospect of finally meeting the man who had saved his life filled him with excitement, gratitude, and an inexplicable anxiety about whether the reality of their encounter could possibly match the significance he had attached to it over 3 decades of searching. What Charles did not know was that Hans Müller had been conducting his own search for the British pilot he had rescued, driven by the same sense of incomplete narrative that had motivated Charles' quest. Across 2 continents and 30 years, Hans Müller had spent the post-war decades building a successful construction company in Munich while battling the psychological demons that had followed him home from the battlefields of France and the Russian front. His war had continued for nearly 2 years after rescuing Charles Hartwell, including the brutal fighting retreat across Western Europe and a final desperate defense of the Reich that had cost him a bullet wound to the left leg and shrapnel scars that still ached in cold weather. Unlike Charles, Hans had not immediately begun searching for his wartime connection, instead focusing his energy on the practical challenges of survival in a devastated Germany where former soldiers faced suspicion and unemployment regardless of their wartime conduct. The decision to look for the British pilot he had rescued emerged gradually during the 1960s, as West Germany's economic miracle provided Hans with financial security and the psychological space to process his wartime experiences. His search methods differed from Charles's systematic approach, relying instead on personal contacts within the network of former Luftwaffe personnel who might remember unusual incidents involving captured Allied airmen. Hans had written letters to British veterans organizations and contacted the Red Cross in hopes of matching his memories with official records, but the bureaucratic obstacles proved formidable for a German citizen seeking information about former enemies. By the early 1970s, Hans had begun to doubt whether he would ever learn the fate of the young British pilot whose life he had saved. Yet he continued his efforts because the rescue represented one of the few moments from his military service that he could remember with pride rather than ambivalence. The war had required Hans to do many things that contradicted his fundamental values, but pulling an enemy airman from a burning cockpit had been an act of pure human decency that helped him maintain some connection to the man he had been before the uniform changed his life forever. The telephone call that connected Charles Hartwell with Hans Müller came on October 15, 1973. Mediated by Weber and conducted in a mixture of English and German that neither man would ever forget. Charles had tracked down Hans through the Munich construction permits office after Weber's 15-year-old address proved outdated, and the conversation began with the awkward formality of former enemies attempting to communicate across linguistic and cultural barriers. Within minutes, however, both men recognized they were speaking with someone who had shared an experience that had profoundly shaped their lives for 30 years. Hans confirmed details of the rescue that Charles remembered, including the location of the crash site, the time of day, and the presence of burning aviation fuel that had threatened to consume both the aircraft and anyone attempting a rescue. More importantly, Hans described his motivation for risking his life to save an enemy pilot, a decision based on his recognition that the unconscious British airman was someone's son who deserved to live regardless of the uniform he wore. Charles found himself struggling to express his gratitude in words that seemed adequate to the magnitude of Hans's courage, while Hans insisted that he had simply done what any decent human being would do under similar circumstances. The conversation lasted nearly 2 hours and covered not only their shared experience, but also their parallel searches for each other, their post-war lives, and their growing realization that the rescue had created a connection between them that transcended the political circumstances of their first meeting. By the end of the call, both men had agreed to meet in person, and Charles began making arrangements for another trip to Munich, with the understanding that this journey would complete a story that had begun in the skies over France 3 decades earlier. The reunion took place in Munich on November 11, 1973, Veterans Day in America, and the anniversary of the armistice that had ended the First World War. In a small restaurant near the Marienplatz, where Hans had suggested they could talk privately. Charles recognized Hans immediately, despite the 30 years that had passed since their first meeting, perhaps because the face of his rescuer had been burned into his memory during those crucial moments of unconsciousness when strong hands had lifted him from death. Hans appeared older than his 52 years, with gray hair and the careful movements of someone whose left leg had never fully recovered from wartime injuries. But his eyes held the same intelligence and humanity that had motivated his rescue of an enemy pilot in 1943. The initial moments of their conversation were stilted as both men struggled with the emotional weight of an encounter they had each imagined thousands of times. But gradually their shared experience created a bridge across the linguistic and cultural differences that might have kept them strangers. Hans spoke of his immediate recognition of Charles's humanity when he saw him trapped in the burning cockpit, a moment of moral clarity that had required no complex ethical calculation, but simply a response to one human being's desperate need for help. Charles described his 30 years of wondering about the identity of his rescuer and his growing conviction that finding Hans was essential to understanding the meaning of his survival. Over the course of 4 hours, they shared stories of their post-war lives, their families, and their careers, discovering unexpected parallels between an English civil engineer and a German construction supervisor who had been shaped by the same moment of crisis in a French wheat field. By the end of their meeting, Charles and Hans had moved beyond gratitude and acknowledgement to something approaching genuine friendship, based on mutual respect and a shared understanding of how a single act of courage could resonate through decades of ordinary life. The relationship that developed between Charles Hartwell and Hans Müller over the following years demonstrated how wartime enemies could become peacetime brothers through the recognition of their shared humanity. Charles made annual trips to Munich, often accompanied by Margaret and their 2 children, who came to regard Hans as an honorary uncle whose presence enriched their family gatherings. Hans reciprocated with visits to Gloucestershire, where he helped Charles restore a vintage Spitfire that now flies in air shows across Britain, with the story of their friendship painted on its fuselage. Their correspondence filled dozens of letters in which they shared personal milestones, professional achievements, and reflections on the war that had brought them together under such extraordinary circumstances. Charles learned about Hans's family, his wife Ingrid, his daughter who became a teacher, and his son who followed his father into the construction business, while Hans came to understand the British character through his friendship with a man who embodied the best qualities of his nation's wartime generation. More significantly, both men became advocates for reconciliation between former enemies, speaking at schools, veterans meetings, and international conferences about the possibility of finding common ground even among those who had once tried to kill each other. Their story attracted media attention throughout Europe, as journalists recognized its potential to illustrate the themes of forgiveness and human decency that were essential to post-war European integration. Neither Charles nor Hans sought publicity for its own sake, but they understood that their friendship could serve as a powerful example of how individual relationships could transcend the political divisions that had once made them enemies. The broader significance of their relationship became clear during the 1980s as Charles and Hans collaborated on educational projects designed to teach young people about the human cost of warfare and the possibility of reconciliation between former adversaries. Working with schools in both Britain and Germany, they developed presentations that used their personal story to illustrate larger themes about moral courage, individual responsibility, and the dangers of dehumanizing people based on their nationality or political beliefs. Charles would describe his experience as a shot-down pilot and the terror of being trapped in a burning aircraft, while Hans would explain his decision to risk his life saving an enemy, and the values that had motivated his action. Students responded powerfully to their first-hand accounts of warfare and reconciliation, often asking penetrating questions about how ordinary people could maintain their humanity under extreme circumstances. The two men discovered that their story resonated particularly strongly with young Germans who struggled to understand their country's wartime behavior, and young Britons who had grown up with stereotyped images of German brutality. By presenting themselves as complex individuals rather than historical abstractions, Charles and Hans helped students understand that war involved ordinary people making difficult choices rather than good nations fighting evil empires. Their educational work expanded to include veterans organizations, religious groups, and international conferences where their friendship served as a tangible example of the reconciliation that had made modern European cooperation possible. Neither man had expected that a moment of human decency in 1943 would eventually contribute to peace education in the 1980s, but they embraced their role as ambassadors for the possibility of friendship between former enemies. Hans Müller passed away peacefully in Munich on March 20, 1992, surrounded by his family and with Charles Hartwell holding his hand as they shared their final conversation about the moment that had defined both of their lives. The funeral drew hundreds of mourners, including former Wehrmacht veterans, British airmen who had flown combat missions over Germany, and dozens of students whose lives had been touched by the story of two enemies who became brothers. Charles delivered one of the eulogies, speaking in German he had learned during their 20-year friendship about Hans's courage, compassion, and commitment to reconciliation between peoples who had been taught to hate each other. The ceremony concluded with a flyover by Royal Air Force Spitfires and German Air Force jets flying in formation, a tribute to both men's military service and their post-war dedication to peace education. Charles continued their joint mission for another 12 years, speaking at schools and conferences about the friendship that had grown from a moment of battlefield humanity and the importance of seeing enemies as fellow human beings rather than abstract threats. His final public appearance came in September 2003, exactly 60 years after the crash that had introduced him to Hans Müller, when Charles addressed a gathering of British and German veterans at the Imperial War Museum in London. At 82 years old, with his voice still strong, but his hands trembling slightly from age, Charles concluded his remarks with a challenge that Hans would have appreciated. We learned that day in France that courage is not just about fighting enemies, but about recognizing the humanity in those we have been taught to hate. The question I leave with you is whether you will have the strength to extend your hand across the divisions that separate you from your fellow human beings. Charles Hartwell died quietly in his sleep on December 3, 2004, having lived long enough to see the European Union expand to include former communist nations and to witness former enemies cooperating in ways that would have seemed impossible during his wartime service. His obituary, published in newspapers across Britain and Germany, identified him as the British pilot who had searched 30 years for the German soldier who saved his life, a quest that had produced one of the 20th century's most remarkable friendships. The story continues to inspire new generations who learn about Charles and Hans through museums, documentaries, and educational programs that use their relationship to teach about reconciliation and the possibility of finding common ground across seemingly impossible divisions. Their correspondence, donated to the Imperial War Museum and the German Historical Museum, provides scholars with insights into how former enemies processed their wartime experiences and built relationships based on mutual respect and shared values. More importantly, their friendship demonstrated that individual acts of moral courage can echo through decades, transforming not only the lives of those directly involved, but also the countless people who hear their story and recognize its relevance to their own relationships with those they have been taught to consider enemies. The wheat field where Charles crashed has been marked with a memorial stone that bears inscriptions in English and German honoring both the rescue and the friendship that grew from it, while the restored Spitfire that Charles and Hans worked on together continues to fly at air shows where their story is told to audiences who marvel at the power of human decency to triumph over political hatred. As visitors stand before the memorial or watch the vintage fighter aircraft climb into European skies, they confront a fundamental question about their own capacity for moral courage. When faced with the choice between following orders and following conscience, between seeing enemies as abstractions and recognizing them as fellow human beings, which path would they choose? The answer, Charles and Hans would have insisted, determines not only individual character, but the possibility of peace in a world too often divided by the illusion that our common humanity is less important than our political differences.